All right, welcome to Chicano Studies 101. This is the last lecture on immigration. I'll be addressing some of the politics and policies from the 1990s and kind of make a comparison to today. You'll see a direct connection, kind of history repeating itself, partly because immigrants tend to be an easy target. By no means am I saying that immigration is right or wrong. Understand that immigration is just a reality of life. People migrate out of necessity, and these people migrated because things were pretty bad, and we could build walls and things like that. But the reality is that we need to start thinking of new ideas that go beyond such kind of simplistic rhetoric, particularly populist rhetoric, that says, no, you can't come in or something like that. Because as we've seen throughout history, immigrants always migrate, partly because the situation back home is much worse than on this side of the border. So we need to start thinking, I hate to say this, but beyond the little box that we put ourselves in. So we'll be looking at policies from the 1990s, and some of these policies might sound familiar because they try to reinvent them today. And then also look at this kind of rise of conservatism and anti-immigrant sentiment. People in Washington use this rhetoric in order to get elected, and it's easy. Like I said earlier, it's an easy target to go after those who have no voice. There's a great Simpsons episode, if you like watching cartoons, that kind of addresses this immigrants issue, where I think there's bears going into town and they blame the immigrants. And sometimes that's how ridiculous it is, right? We tend to blame immigrants for every little thing that goes wrong, and a lot of times it's other issues. Yet they're the ones who become the scapegoat. And then we're going to also finally, at the very end, address how Latino culture is changing America, and that's just a fact. Every year we kind of say, well, Latinos will be the new group that will define politics, and we're getting closer to that reality in very important states like California and Florida and New York, right? Latinos are on the rise, and America is definitely changing, and that's a good thing. Life always changes. That's just been the constant in life. So Latinos are taking a prominent role, and the future is Latino. So why was there such a kind of anti-immigrant sentiment in the 1990s? Well, there's a few things happening in the 1990s. In the 1990s, you begin to see a lot of kind of conflicts amongst people. One of the best examples that kind of exemplify this is the Rodney King beating in the 1990s, where police beat this African-American man. It was captured on tape. This is before social media. It made it through all the news cycles at that time, and it caused an uproar where African Americans were tired of being abused by police. It wasn't just this one example. It's just that this has been a common experience for African Americans. So places like Los Angeles became this kind of black-brown metropolis. And also in Los Angeles, and really throughout the United States, you have this what's called deindustrialization. At one time, America used to have all these kind of good manufacturing jobs. By the 1970s, 80s, and definitely 90s, these manufacturing jobs began to leave. They began to leave to China. I think we're kind of feeling that pinch right now, right? So you see how, this causes friction because there's not many good paying jobs. The gap between rich and poor explodes in the 1990s. And you have a city that is just kind of building up this tension, and the Rodney King riots, the LA riots with the Rodney King beating situation kind of just fueled that and just exploded after that. Really, one of the main causes of this friction is a recession that we had in 1991, and it lasted all the way to 1993. I was alive during this period. I remember this recession, and a lot of it had to do with Ronald Reagan's policies. And his whole kind of Reaganomics that kind of never really fully trickled down. And our national debt increase, George Bush Sr. ended up paying the price for that. He made this very famous statement of no new taxes. And he had no choice but by the 1990s, to raise taxes to pay all these kind of tax breaks that that Ronald Reagan gave to the rich. And this recession cost him the election, which is when Bill Clinton came into office. So, these kind of conflicts don't come out of nowhere, right? This particular situation was very much so rooted in the politics and economic policies of the 1980s that unfortunately spilled into the 1990s. Like today, that they're doing all these bailouts, as you can kind of see now, and somebody's gonna have to pay those bills one day, right? And right now it sounds good. Everybody's getting free money, but eventually we're gonna have to pay that bill back, and it's gonna be Joe taxpayer is gonna pay it. So in the early 90s, you really don't see immigration as a major issue. Nobody really cared about immigration as the recession kind of started, but as it started to take hold, all of a sudden immigration became the number one topic in people's head. And in California specifically, this is what we're looking at here, there was a proposition called 187, and this proposition basically told people who were not here legally, with papers, that they could not use government resources, things like healthcare, welfare, that type of situation. Now understand that many of these immigrants have been here for years, and they also have kids here. So part of the complaint was that they felt as though their kids weren't going to be able to go to school, even though they were U.S. citizens. So in the mid-90s, when the economy really begins to tank, Governor Pete Wilson was up for re-election, and his popularity was kind of low. So what did he do? Well, he took an issue that's easy to kind of round people around, right? To corral people around, and that is immigration. So in 1991, he was a moderate. Again, immigration wasn't on his scope there. By the mid-90s, then his tune begins to change. He had an approval rating of 28%, and because he is a politician and wants to get reelected, this became his number one issue. And he hired this guy named Glenn Spencer. I won't show you the videos, but I typically have videos, and here you see a little cartoon where they start making statements like, our borders are out of control, 4,000 to 5,000 people are coming over, and they start showing images and these political ads as though it's just this kind of massive wave of immigrants coming to the United States. Again, sounds very reminiscent of what happened not too many years ago when our current person in the White House was showing those pictures of the caravans that are coming, making it sound like every day it was that many people trying to enter the United States. Well, again, it's very problematic. It was just these kind of few times that you have these things happening. And again, these numbers were actually wrong, completely wrong. The reality was quite the opposite, is that immigration had essentially stopped because during recessions, people don't tend to migrate. Why would they come over here? There's no jobs, right? There's no opportunities. So the kind of key years of immigration were in the early 80s. By the 1990s, those numbers had completely slowed down. But when it comes to the voters, a lot of times they don't see reality. They just like to hear what the people that they follow say, or the news cycle that they follow say. And that's what kind of happened here, is like, well, they didn't really care that numbers had essentially stopped. They cared that the economy was bad and they needed to blame somebody for it. Another kind of major issue that kind of conservatives started making is that immigrants were taking over schools. Well, the reality is that no, the majority of because when they talk about immigrant, it becomes synonymous with Latino, or particularly Mexican. And we find that the majority of them were actually U.S. born, so they had every right to be in schools. However, one of the major arguments is that these immigrants don't pay enough tax money to pay for schooling. And the reality is quite different, is that they do pay their fair share. We all pay taxes in different ways. When you go to a store, you have to pay a tax on your food, right? On your chips and your Doritos and stuff like that. When you buy goods at the store, you pay taxes on that. Where you live, you pay taxes on your home. Even if you're renting, you're still paying money into this system, right? Because maybe you're not sending a check to the county or something like that, but you're still sending a check to the property owner, and they pay property taxes. Ergo, you are paying taxes. So your kids can go to school, and it funds all these other things, streets and so forth. So this myth that immigrants don't pay their fair share, it's quite skewed, because they do pay more than their fair share. But again, this stuff doesn't seem to matter. In the 1990s, you begin to see, in the mid-90s in particular, a backlash against those who certain groups in California consider undesirable. And they begin to, at first, attack immigrants, but this begins to spill over to people who were people of color. So things like affirmative action. So regardless of how you feel affirmative action did help many minorities get into universities. So this no longer had anything to do with immigration, but really just kind of attacking some of the civil rights legislation that passed in the 1960s and 70s. So affirmative action, the perception is always that you have a really unqualified minority competing with an overqualified Anglo-American, and that the minority always kind of gets the job. And it's never that. It's quite the opposite. It's really apples to apples. And depending on the year, at one time they had quotas. They needed maybe 10% of the workforce needed to be African American or something like that. But actually the biggest benefactor were actually white people of affirmative action. It's actually women who benefited from affirmative action more than any other group. So it's kind of funny that they were attacking the program that maybe helped them or helped their wives get a job somewhere, because affirmative action helped not just people of color, but white women in particular. And it's quite surprising that they were critiquing it without realizing that they were the benefactors of the program. But in 2009, in the 1990s, they passed Proposition 209, where it essentially eliminated affirmative action at the UC system. And this really kind of hurt the Latino community, because the numbers began to kind of dwindle in regards to students of color who were going to university. I myself was a product of affirmative action. And, I kind of thank this program because it got me into school. And I think I am up to par with any other student at that time. So it's not like I was the dumbest student in the class or anything like that, but unfortunately that's the way it's always been kind of presented. All right, I'll stop it right here, and I'll come right back to do the second half.